When I was a kid, one time my mom and dad wanted me to eat my vegetables and I wanted to play. And so, as a 2-year-old, I decided to rage against my parents' authority by grabbing the ham off my mother's plate, throwing it to the ground, and stomping on it. Now, they couldn't believe what I was doing. And of course, in my 2-year-old mind, that made perfectly good sense. But we know that rebellion and raging against authority is nothing new. You see, children do this and they go through various stages of rebelling against and challenging authority. And adults do this too. Nations do this. And of course, they rebel against an even greater king, King Jesus. You see, this is powerfully depicted in Psalm chapter 2. And it's one of the Psalms I've been reading as my Advent song as we're longing for Jesus to return again as we look back to his first arrival. We remember that he came as the conquering king, but he didn't come to a peaceful world. He came to a weary world, and it makes me think of the O Holy Night, a thrill of hope. The weary world rejoices. Jesus came into a weary world. The nations were raging, and Psalm 2 captures this with the nations raging, plotting, and conspiring against God and his anointed one. That'd be King Jesus. And of course, what do they say? They want to throw off the chains of God, and they want to throw off the chains and the shackles they feel are binding them to slavery, and they feel that it's restrictive. And as we read that, as we meditate on that, we realize that the chains of Christ are not restrictive, but life sustaining. You see, the very thing they were wishing to cast off was the thing holding them to a rock in the middle of a flood. So the king responds, much like how my parents responded after I stomped on the ham, had my rage against their authority moment. They looked at me and they laughed. It's all they could do. I was no threat to their power. I wasn't threatening them in any way. They weren't worried about what I could do to them. I mean, I was stomping on the ham, but that's about where it ended. And much like that, as the nations rage, plot, and conspire against God, he in heaven, he laughs. And if you read the verses 4 through 6 of Psalm chapter 2, you'll see that the king laughs, he ridicules, he displays anger and wrath towards the rebellious nations. And he laughs in part because these conspiring and plotting kingdoms and kings really are doing so in vain. They're no threat to his authority. They're no threat to the true king. So he laughs, and then he uses some shocking language, the psalmist does, using ridicule, terror, anger, and wrath. And these are hard words. They're meant to shock you as you read it, that there is punishment and judgment for our rebellion, for the kings of earth, but also for each of us. You see, my parents didn't just laugh at me. They sent me to my room. Why? Because my behavior needed to be corrected. It was not good. And just in the same way, our rebellion against God leads to more death and more destruction. It leads to a weary world. And see, God desires us to have peace in him, and we can't do that when we're raging against him. And so, with that said, the king issues judgment. In the very last part in verse 6, the king establishes his king. And he says, I will establish my king on Zion. And see, he doesn't just end it with judgment. He offers hope, hope in a king to come. And of course, for Israel in context, that meant the kings that were above them, the Israeli kings, but they all failed. And to leave them wanting and wondering when God's true king would come to establish peace. And in fact, if you read verses 7 through 9, you see what this king and kingdom will look like. You see, the kingdom is the Son, and that would be, we know, as Jesus, but this would be something the kings of Israel would have said on their coronation day. But Paul quotes this very verse saying that Jesus was crowned king at his resurrection. You see, Christmas and Easter are intimately linked. Jesus came to die and to rise again. And in doing so, as the Son, he gets the kingdoms as his inheritance. You see, in Psalm 8, he said 2:8, he says the kingdoms will be his inheritance, and he will break them with an iron scepter. Jesus came to receive the kingdom purpose, which was to bring judgment to the nations, but also the kingdom inheritance, which is all nations. And so no earthly king has ever had control of all nations and can't rightly judge nations, but Jesus can. And he does. And Paul links into that as he's talking in Acts chapter 13, verse 33. And as we get to the close of our Psalm chapter 2, you see my parents, they sent me to my room, but they didn't leave me there. I did eventually get out. No, my parents opened the door with their arms wide, offering a sign of love and affection, saying, "Come and hug me, son," saying it's not over. And see, in the same way, Jesus doesn't just leave us in our rebellion. He doesn't just leave us in judgment, though he'd be right to. See, our rebellion is a lot worse than stomping on Ham. But Jesus would be correct in leaving us in judgment and breaking us, and that be it. But he doesn't. The psalmist ends with saying, "Now, you kings of earth, be wise." This is an invitation for the very rebellious people, the same rebellious people in the first part, to come and embrace the king. He said, "Serve the Lord, receive instruction, and rejoice in the king." And he ends with often in our language, very odd ending. He says, "Kiss the Son." We say that's strange, but it's the idea of kissing the king's ring. It's submission, it's worship and reverence. And he's saying, embrace the Son in worship. Embrace God's King in worship. And the psalmist is giving an invitation to these rebellious nations to come and embrace the King in worship, to serve him, to rejoice in him, and to receive instruction from him. And that same invitation goes out to us as well. You see, the beautiful thing about reading this psalm at Christmas time, it's beautiful any time of the year, but at Christmas time, is that we have a great message that we get to tell everybody. We get to tell them why we celebrate, why we sing all of these songs, why we have a thrill of hope in a weary world. Because we get to go and say, the King's arms are wide open. Embrace him today. Well, from all of us rooted together, I hope that you're having a very Merry Christmas. I'm having a wonderful time celebrating the birth of our King through Advent blocks and a lot of other Advent stories and psalms, reading and meditating on God's Word. As you can tell, I'm here in southern Taiwan where it's a balmy 63 degrees. That's winter here. So I know it might be colder where you are, and if it is, send some of that cold here. But I hope you have a very Merry Christmas, and I'll see you before the new year.